Hello, namaste, how are you? Jefferson Glassie here, author of Heaven is Everywhere and the forthcoming book, Fonging for the World, and audiobooks. And I want to give you a report today on a book I read that's very, very important and influential. The book is Matriarchal Societies by Heidi Goettner-Abendroth. And it's very important for our time, and I think it's the information is some of the most important information that we need to be able to create a better world for everyone, and I mean that literally. This book is an extensively researched book about indigenous cultures around the world. I've made some notes because I want to be able to get this as accurately as I can. I think there are a number of historic details and information that we just don't know about or don't understand. Certainly many people feel what Heidi is talking about in this book, but let's go through it and I'll explain to you what I mean. She says, and I believe this is true, patriarchal societies are a recent development within the last 4,000 to 5,000 years. Most indigenous cultures in prior human history were matriarchal, but most have been oppressed in modern history. Patriarchal societies have wreaked havoc on women, children, men as well, and all sorts of non-human species. Patriarchal domination depends on minority rule developed from wars of conquest that took over cultures based on cruel and violent oppression and enforcement, characterized by private ownership, colonial rule, and religious conversion. Matriarchal societies are gender egalitarian and have these main characteristics, as Heidi explains in the book. They are balanced economies based on mutuality, reciprocity, gratitude, a gift perspective, and reverence and respect for nature, with mothers at the center of society. Matriarchal societies are based on matrilineal lineage, which is based on the mother's line of ancestry, and they are non-hierarchical. They're based on consensus governance, with women as custodians of the clan property. And matriarchal societies are spiritual, sacred. They have spiritual attitudes about life based on creation and the divine feminine. They believed all of life was sacred and to be respected. It becomes very clear when reading the histories of what we know about these societies that women were the originators, the progenitors of human life on the planet. Certainly men are needed, but those who basically brought humans up, who nurtured humans, were the women. They were the creators of not just the children, but also language, agriculture, textiles, cooking, music, and shamanism, spirituality. Language and music was created likely by the voiced intimacy of women and their relationships with children. Indigenous women were likely as strong, muscular, and fast as men. Their strength in economic and nurturing roles in societies serves the greater well-being of the community, not the individual interest of a few. Relationships were key to matriarchal societies and supported the gift economies, where the highest prestige went to those who gave the most to the society rather than those who accumulated wealth. In matriarchies, values are not based on competition and aggression, but rather on motherly care and nurturing. Initiation rites of women throughout the ages were highly valued and celebrated, but not as much for men, and this makes a lot of sense. We have to talk about sexual relationships, obviously. Monogamy was not known in indigenous cultures. Women generally had free choice of sexual partners, and many cultures recognized sexuality as healthy, positive, and spiritual, with women being more erotically active as they would choose. Women generally lived in their mother's clans, in their mother's houses, with their sisters and children and their brothers and uncles. Paternity was often not significant. Fathers, if known, typically lived with their mothers. Sometimes they lived with their wives. Visiting marriages were common, where the men only stayed overnight. Otherwise, they would go back home to their mothers or their own house. Many clans had group marriages, such as between a clan where the sisters of one clan would sort of have a marriage with the brothers of another clan. And this was good for diversity, and it was sort of natural. A lot of the matriarchal societies were matrilocal. They were based in local areas and were not so much national. I mean, there were marriages in many of these indigenous societies, but typically they were easily and casually ended at the woman's choice. Forced monogamy, such as in marriage, is actually patriarchal because it takes away women's choice. Patriarchy really harms women and humanity in many ways. Obviously, through violence, oppression, and cruelty. We see this every day. Europeans burned hundreds, if maybe not thousands, of women alleging they were witches. Men rape, beat, murder, and subjugate women in all areas of patriarchal society. In radical Hinduism, as an example, a woman is nothing without her husband, and so often they're burned with the husband when he dies. By destroying matriarchal, matrilineal, and matrilocal clan structures, excuse me, that protect women, and by imposing private ownership, marriage, nuclear families versus clans, taking women's votes and voices away, women who were left by men and their children became defenseless and subject to financial instability, poverty. The major religions, including Christianity and Islam in particular, but also Judaism, Hinduism, and others, are very patriarchal in nature. Having taken away and supplanted matriarchal spirituality and relationships with nature. Still, men adopted many of the features of the women's shamanic and spiritual practices, such as the ornate feminine clothing that we see in modern religions controlled and run by men, and their festivals. They kind of co-opted a lot of the goddess festivals and many spiritual concepts. Men have taken away women's power by making the female features of creation, such as menstruation, birth, nursing, and sex, they made them dirty and impure. Even, for example, adopting such obscene practices as genital mutilation. And all this, even though men are not oppressed in matriarchies. They are egalitarian, balanced, and more peaceful. Matriarchies were prevalent in indigenous cultures around the world. Here are just a few examples. In the Hopi tribes in North America, women would court the men, and they had very free attitudes about sex. Everything in the culture was a prayer and there were spiritual ceremonies year-round. Women had free choices in sex, and when women decided to end a marriage relationship, she just put her husband's clothes outside, and he would return to his mother's or sister's family. In the Arawak cultures of South America, all aspects of childbirth were women's affairs. And the men's lineage was not as significant, but these matriarchal cultures in Central and South America were overcome by the patriarchal sun cults of the Incas in Peru and the Aztecs in Mexico. There were, as you may have heard, all female tribes in South America, the Amazons. There were only women in these tribes. The women were strong and skilled, construction workers, warriors. They did not include men in these tribes. But when they felt the urge, when they wanted to create, they would conquer a local town or village, use the men until pregnancies resulted, then return the men to the villages. The Iroquois, also called the Haudenosaunee of northeastern North America, was a well-defined confederacy of clans that rejected the cruelty of the patriarchy and codified matriarchal consensus governance, which they called the Great Law of Peace, adopted, some say, in 1142 CE. The tribal structure was based on the concept of living together in longhouses. The male chiefs were selected by the women. The women were the ultimate guardians of the culture, including determinations with respect to war or peace. In India, the Nayar woman had free choice in sexuality, and as Heidi says in her book, it's a quote, it was said, no honorable woman would go around with covered breasts, because the women's power was accepted and people recognized that, and it was good for everyone. Visiting marriages were common. But what does all this mean? I've been on a personal mission, really, to figure out how to have peace in the world. It's clear we're now subject to highly patriarchal societies. Toxic masculinity is wrecking our world. Hyper-capitalism, military aggression, and oppression of women. As we see this in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and here in the United States, where currently men are seeking to control women's reproductive rights, excuse me, and take away the free choice and protection women have in matriarchal societies. This puts human survival and the planet at risk. I've been focused on a path to peace being music recently, but it's clear to me that what we really need is a return to the peace and balance inherent in the matriarchal culture. We need a return to an appreciation of the divine feminine, the nurturing of the mothers, protection of women, to economies based on mutuality, reciprocity, and gratitude, and the perspectives of the indigenous gift cultures. I believe democracy is matriarchal, and autocracy, fascism, are patriarchal. We may not be able to return to the indigenous days of 10,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, but what we can do, especially as we approach the elections here in the U.S., is to put more women in leadership positions, not only in politics, but in all realms of society, to bring back those concepts that are inherent in matriarchal societies, peace and balance. We need the perspective of the divine feminine and must learn from information that's been provided about our true history, such as this book that Heidi has written. Thank you, Heidi, for all that you do. Finally, I'm continuing down this path of study, and I'm now reading a book called When the Women Were Drummers by Lane Redmond, which talks about the fact that the original musicians likely, I'm sure, were women. That's important. More on that soon. I hope this has been helpful. I'm just trying to put information out there that I think is important. I would suggest this book to anyone who is interested in finding out sort of the truth of humanity and what the best, most nurturing, most harmonious structure would be. Thank you. Namaste.